As I mentioned a moment ago, the American failure at the Bay of Pigs emboldened Khrushchev to try to push the West out of Berlin. And so now I turn to part three, the 1961 Berlin crisis, the most dangerous place on earth. Europe was the center of the Cold War chessboard. And West Berlin was at the center square of that chessboard. The transition of East and West Germany from the four Allied occupation zones in 1949 left West Berlin exposed 110 miles inside of East Germany. As the Cold War conflict unfolded, the city of West Berlin became a perpetual point of infernal danger. West Berlin, a lonely pawn at the center of the board, anchored the Cold War in dangerous conflict and reciprocal hostility that would grip the world for the next 3 decades. Dividing Germany, the first step in Khrushchev's plan to get rid of the ulcer of West Berlin. In 1958, Khrushchev had demanded a German peace treaty to permanently legitimize the division of Germany. That demand remained when the Paris Eisenhower-Khrushchev Summit Conference exploded in May 1960. And it would become the focal point of Khrushchev's secret scheme for testing the newly elected 44-year-old American president and removing the ulcer of West Berlin. The first aftershock of the Bay of Pigs fiasco was Kennedy's decision not to invade Laos. The second aftershock was Khrushchev's decision to test Kennedy on West Berlin. Khrushchev's plans to ambush Kennedy at the Vienna summit. In early March 1961, Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to have a summit meeting in Vienna. In March, KGB chief Shelepin told Khrushchev that the US was preparing to blockade Cuba and intervene there with US forces. When the Cuban brigade landed at the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev warned JFK a new conflagration might erupt elsewhere, i.e. Berlin. Khrushchev took the Bay of Pigs failure as a sign of JFK's weakness and inexperience. The Vienna summit would become a Soviet snare. The June 1961 Vienna summit. The 3 June discussion in the American ambassador's office was a preliminary sparring match by both leaders. But during the 4 June meeting, Khrushchev said, quote, "Berlin is the most dangerous place in the world. The USSR wants to perform an operation on this soft spot to eliminate this thorn, this ulcer." Khrushchev confronted JFK with a bombshell. The USSR planned to sign a peace treaty with East Germany, after which all rights of Western access to Berlin will expire. Khrushchev said, "I want peace, but if you want war, that is your problem." JFK replied, "It is you, not I, who wants to force a change." And as they parted, Kennedy remarked, "It will be a cold winter." The decision to build the Berlin Wall. In July 1961, the refugee outflow from East to West Berlin rose to 1,000 educated, mostly educated and technically trained people every day. Khrushchev then decided to build the Berlin Wall. Super secret handwritten progress reports were forwarded to Moscow via courier. No telephone or radio transmissions were permitted. On 13 August, barricades sealed off the crossing points to West Berlin. In the next few weeks, a formidable, heavily fortified, guarded, and booby-trapped cement barrier was erected. JFK thought privately that the border closure was a good turning point. He said, "It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." But at that point, JFK drew a line in the sand over West Berlin. JFK's July 1961 warning on Berlin. By the summer of 1961, the Berlin crisis had evolved into the most dangerous flashpoint for nuclear conflict since the onset of the Cold War. In a 25 July 1961 televised address, JFK warned that the immediate threat to world freedom was in West Berlin. He said Soviet ambitions now meet in basic confrontation over Berlin. Quote, the showcase of liberty and great testing place of Western courage and will since 1945. And so the Berlin crisis escalated. On 22 August, the Soviet Union threatened Western air corridors to Berlin. Access to East Berlin was cut to one crossing point, Checkpoint Charlie. The Allies quickly deployed 1,000 troops, backed by 10 tanks, at the wall in defiance of the imposition of a 100-meter standoff rule. On 31 August, the Soviets deployed tanks in all towns close to the border. And on 23 September, the US 7th Army was placed on alert. 2 days later, Kennedy reaffirmed the United States' resolve to defend West Berlin. And at this point, President Kennedy decided to lay down his trump cards on the table for everybody to see, revealing US nuclear superiority. On 21 October, the president ordered Deputy Secretary of Defense Kilpatrick to give a speech in Hot Springs, West Virginia, to some business people, revealing that the US had 600 heavy bombers, 6 Polaris submarines with 96 missiles, dozens of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and large carrier strike forces, totaling tens of thousands of nuclear delivery vehicles with multiple warheads. This was the final death gurgle of the alleged Soviet ICBM lead and a concomitant public display of overwhelming American superiority in the strategic nuclear balance of power. Although the game continued, at the secret level, it was really over. On 25 October 1961, US tanks moved into West Berlin, and for the first time in years, 33 Soviet manned tanks, accompanied by troops, entered the city limits of East Berlin. For the first time during the Cold War, both sides ended up with 10 tanks with engines running, facing each other at Checkpoint Charlie. A standoff at Checkpoint Charlie occurred. The American tanks with bulldozer blades were conspicuously shown, while American helicopters buzzed over the checkpoint, ignoring East German and Soviet protests. What was really going on is shown by new evidence that Khrushchev was in a situation he did not want to be in. His decision to put Soviet armor in East Berlin was actually an attempt to claw back control of the crisis from the aggressive East Germans. On the brink of war over West Berlin, the standoff lasted for 16 long hours, when Moscow was aware that 4 US missile-firing atomic Polaris submarines were submerged in the North Sea, each with 16 warheads aimed at targets in the Soviet Union. At Checkpoint Charlie, the Soviet guard post was talking through the Soviet high command to Khrushchev. The US guard post was communicating through the US military in Berlin to President Kennedy. The Kennedy-Khrushchev back channel. President Kennedy asked General Clay, his emissary in the guardhouse, the American guardhouse at Checkpoint Charlie, if he was nervous. Nervous? No, we're not nervous here, Clay answered. If anybody's nervous, Mr. President, it will probably be people in Washington. JFK, with his feet up on his desk during the call, said, well, there may be a lot of nervous people around here, but I'm not one of them. General Clay didn't know that Bobby Kennedy was talking with his friend and USSR intelligence contact, Bolshakov, during the tank confrontation that occurred at Checkpoint Charlie. Within hours, JFK and Khrushchev were messaging through RFK and Bolshakov. How cooler heads prevailed. On 26 October, Kennedy offered to go easy over Berlin in the future if the Soviets removed their tanks first. Khrushchev later revealed, "I assured my comrades that as soon as we pulled back our tanks, the Americans will pull back their tanks within 20 minutes. After the Soviet tanks pulled back, Khrushchev reported, "Just as I expected, it did take only 20 minutes for the Americans to respond." And with that choreographed scene, the 1961 Berlin crisis ended. And what can we take away from this event? Well, Kennedy had misjudged Khrushchev, and Khrushchev had misjudged Kennedy. In the end, nuclear war was averted when both leaders worked through a back channel instead of through their subordinates. And then Khrushchev soon realized he had to make a desperate decision. Outgunned and surrounded by American power, Khrushchev realized that there was only one way that he could get leverage to level the imbalance of strategic nuclear power: by deploying medium and intermediate range Soviet missiles in Cuba.